Received apologies for Kate Nicholl and from our chairperson Philip Brett. We are joined online by Jonathan Buckley, and we're expected to be joined by Podrick as well. And in the room we've Sinead McLaughlin, David Honeyford, Emma Sheeran and Diana Armstrong. There's no members yet in the public gallery. I'm just going to allow them time to come in. Okay, and just remind members in the public gallery to mute their phones, and that we will be recording this session and it will be broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. Declarations of interest. Have any members any declarations? No, and you can do so by mentioning it throughout the meeting anyway. Chairperson's business. Members, there's a few items of chairperson's business which I'll just go through now. Stranmillis University College. Members, last week the committee noted the ACS review of Stranmillis University College. The relevant report referred to a risk of sustained and future reductions in the teacher demand model numbers, which identifies the number of students that Stranmillis can enrol on teacher education. It also referred to competition from online providers of teacher education and options for status change. Members, it's just to seek your agreement that we write to the Department for Education seeking clarity on the teacher demand model numbers, and also to write to the Department for the Economy seeking commentary on the way forward based on the report's recommendations in respect of Stranmillis. Is members happy?
Yeah.
Yep. The next item is NI Screen. Again, members, last week we noted the ICS review of NI Screen. The terms of reference for that review excluded the assessment of strategic alignment, performance and the impact of the economic strand of Northern Ireland Screen's remit, as this was covered by the SIB evaluation of the Open Door Strategy 18 to 22. Members, do you agree that we write to the Department seeking sight of the SIB review of NI Screen strategy and the economic appraisal for the 22-26 strategy? Members content? Yep. The Careers Action Plan. Members, you will have seen, or you may have seen in the Assembly questions AQW 23829, the Minister referred to the imminent publication of the Careers Action Plan. It is hoped that officials will speak to this when they come to our committee in the joint concurrence session on the 14th of May. Is the committee content to note? And obviously we'll follow up at that joint session. Student loans. Members, again in Assembly questions, reference was made to the adoption of a new model for the valuation of the student loan book and the treatment of earnings projections from the 1st of April of this year. These changes were not shared with the committee and may affect the substantial sums of debt write-off funding which is currently unspent. Peter, do you want to say anything about that?
Just about that, it's in Assembly questions. So if you recall, the CNAG has disclaimed her audit opinion of the Department for the Economy. Now, there were a few things. One of the things was the treatment of the loan book, so that students in Northern Ireland take out student loans. That goes into a big book. It's a couple of £1 billion. And the way it's valued in England changed from the way it's valued in Northern Ireland. So what the Department is now going to do is value it in the same way as they do in England, and they're going to do that apparently from 1st of April 2025. So it's just to suggestion, Chairperson, if you write to the Department, just seek an explanation just of that. I think I can understand why they're doing it, but they didn't tell the committee, so it just might be interesting to follow up.
Members content we write to the Department to seek clarity on it. Okay, the final items just in relation to AI research. Members, in the Assembly questions, again reference was made to AI research, both by the AI Collaboration Centre at Queen's, which is undertaking an AI ecosystem baseline study, and by the Matrix panel, which is to report to the Department in the autumn. Members, are you in agreement that we write to the Department seeking a briefing on these research papers whenever it is available? Yep. Content. Okay. Members, I refer to page 7 of your meeting packs, where you'll find the draft minutes of our meeting on the 19th of March. Are members content that the draft minutes are accurate and a complete record of the committee's deliberations?
Sorry, Chairperson, I think Mr. Doherty wants to come in.
Oh, apologies. Sorry,
Clerk. It was just looking at the clarification. I should have just declared an interest, but my link wasn't working. So just declared an interest as a member of the PAC just for the second previous item.
Okay, no problem. Okay, thanks, Clerk. You've got that.
Gavelin.
Members, are you content that the draft minutes as presented on page 7 are a complete and accurate record of our deliberations?
Yeah.
Yep, agreed. Okay. Matters arising. There are none from my perspective. Does anybody else have any matters arising? We'll proceed down the agenda. All right. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to invite our delegation from the Ulster University Economic Policy Centre to come forward. Thank you. Members, I refer to the clerk's cover note at page 20 of your meeting packs, and I want to extend a formal welcome to Gareth Hetherington and Dr. Owen McGuinness, both from the Ulster University Economic Policy Centre. You're very welcome. We thank you for the reports that you've shared with us. Members will find those within their packs. So I'm just going to invite you to maybe give an opening statement, and obviously then the committee will follow up with some questions based on that. So over to yourselves.
Thank you, Chair, for your invitation to discuss our research with your committee, and good morning, everyone. I will make a very brief statement by way of introduction before handing over to my colleague, Dr. Owen McGuinness, who led on this research. As some of you may know, the Ulster University Economic Policy Centre has now been providing independent economic advice to policymakers and ministers for over a decade. We conduct research across a number of work streams on devolved policy areas, such as the labour market, which includes analysis of the skills needs of the economy and research on re-engaging the economically inactive. We also provide support to local government, for example, with their city and growth deals bids. And there are other strategic areas of interest, including rates revenue raising, providing advice on targeting of reliefs to sectors most impacted by the pandemic, and more recently demographic analysis to help inform infrastructure investment. In addition, we also conduct research on topics we identify as being of interest to the broader policy-making community, which are aligned to the policy scope of our sponsor departments, in this case the Department for the Economy. Given regional balance is one of the Economy Minister's 4 priority areas, we considered it appropriate to conduct some initial research to understand the nature and scale of imbalance across these islands and within Northern Ireland, and to provide some evidence to help inform the debate moving forward. As Dr. McGuinness will outline, achieving regional balance has been difficult in all jurisdictions, and therefore reaching that goal is likely to be a long-term project. As a result, we consider this an area we and others will return to many times in the years ahead. With that, I'll hand over to Dr. McGuinness.
Thanks, Gareth. And thanks again for inviting us. I'll just give you a little bit of an initial brief, as with the papers with you, but just maybe to highlight some of the key points before we go into it. And also, I suppose, just update the committee. The intention is to publish the full report next month in April. It's been a wee bit later, but these things sometimes take it. And I'll come back to one of the things we've added to it. I think that adds a bit of value to the overall thinking within the report. And we've had a team. Well, Gareth said I was leading on it. I have colleagues there, Anastasia Desmond, Miles Patton and Todd Gowdy have all worked on the report with me as well as that. And our intention really was to provide an evidence base, or perhaps baseline, of where we're at in terms of current sub-regional economic performance, where we've come from, and then what factors might lie behind the different local trajectories over that period, and are likely, all things being equal or all things staying as they are, to continue if we were to continue along the same trajectory as we have in the past. What would be likely to be the case into the future? It's become possible to do this sort of work more accurately, I should say, in recent years, because there's been improvement to sub-regional data provided by NISRA and indeed by the Office of National Statistics. This is something that you've seen across advanced economies, really, as local differentials have become more important. There's also been improvement in the analytical techniques that we've been able to use in the report. So those two things made it possible to do the work in a different way as we might have done it in the past. So I'm just going to take a couple of different points from the research just to highlight those. As I said just a moment ago, inequality or regional inequalities are become more of an issue in recent years. They've been widening, I suppose, is the key thing right across the advanced economies. It's not an issue unique to Northern Ireland. We have our own unique issues here, but it's not this widening sub-regional inequality isn't one that's unique to us. And since the 1990s, it goes back as far as that. I think now you could make that case. Whilst we've seen greater economic convergence between countries have tended to come together, the regions within those, in many cases, have widened out. So in a sense, when we've seen catch-up, between countries, you see divergence within those countries, I suppose, is a key thing. Two important points really to add to that. The greater level of divergence tends to happen at the smaller regional level. So the smaller the unit you get, the greater the divergence. Larger regions whilst those have also moved apart from one another, they haven't to the same degree, and in some cases they've kind of converged in some countries. And secondly, I suppose some countries have actually bucked the trend of widening sub-regional economic inequalities. Of these two islands, both in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, unfortunately that's not the case. In both the UK and in the Republic, you're seeing growing sub-regional inequalities. But we have seen countries buck that trend, and that's probably an important point in terms of regional policy, but also how that's happened. I can come back to that in the questions. So the second point then, I suppose, within Northern Ireland, the regional performance gaps are, I think there's three things to say about them. They're clear, the gaps, they're evident, self-evident. I think the Sub-Regional Economic Action Plan highlights that very well. They're persistent over time. So we've seen gaps there that have persisted over a long period of time. The third thing probably is the interesting one. Some of them are showing different trajectories. So it's not only we're kind of seeing some convergence in labour market or resident-based indicators, but wider divergence in workplace or kind of company firm performance ones. So I suppose it's an important point, and that's something that's in common across a lot of advanced economies where there has been convergence in. So I suppose the way I'd say that, if you were looking at regional divergence 20 years ago, you would predominantly been talking about higher level of unemployment in one place compared to another. That is not to say that that gap has disappeared entirely, but that's closed to a large degree, whereas now you're talking about different levels of productivity, sometimes different levels of wages in one part of the country to another. So that the trajectories of the different indicators have gone in different ways. And also, I suppose, another thing I would say, and when we talk about this internally, or even talk about it the odd time you'd be asked at home what you're doing, and it would be an odd time, but nonetheless, when that comes up, I would always say there's two ways of looking at this issue. One, and these aren't mutually exclusive, but one is, for all of us, we come from a local area. What we're interested in is, how is our local area doing relative to somewhere else? That's the key thing. I'm from Warrenpoint. Is Warrenpoint doing better than somewhere else within Newry Morningdown? Is Newry Morningdown doing better than another place, or worse? Is generally, we tend to go to the negative. Are we doing worse than somewhere else doing better than us? So that's one way of looking at it. The second way, as I say, these aren't mutually exclusive, is how is the overall picture doing? Are we converging or diverging at a level of the North or Northern Ireland? Or if you're in the Republic, are you doing at that? So it's not just about how County Clare is doing relative to Galway, but is the west of Ireland converging with the rest of Dublin and the other regions in the south? So I suppose there's two different ways of looking at it, is the thing. And I think some of the gaps, it's important to say that it's not everything is worsening. There are some gaps that are closing. I suppose that's an important point to make. The third thing then, just to say, is that when we did the shift share analysis, and it's quite technical, I can chat people through what that is, but I suppose what that kind of is to try and explain is change over time in local economies, and the factors that lie behind that. There isn't anything that's hugely surprising in that, except to say that in some places the sectoral structure of those local economies is more important to their positive or negative performance than it is in other places, and that tends to suggest that it's a bit like the productivity issue. When people come in to explain or talk about productivity, there's two elements to that. One is what we do in terms of where our sectoral structures are, and the other thing is how we do what we're doing. So are we more productive in manufacturing in Northern Ireland than, say, manufacturing somewhere else? And the shift share analysis shows the same. So some of it's to do with industrial mix, industrial structure, some of it's to do with local competitiveness in that. Interestingly enough, Belfast, driven largely by concentrations in high growth sectors, and yet in recent years, probably since 2016 onwards, there's a peaking out of that, which may suggest that local competitiveness in Belfast isn't as strong as it has been in the past. So there's concerns there, even in some of the higher performing districts. So I suppose another point here is on how the approaches have changed to regional policy. The regional action, or the sub-regional plan, I think reflects something of the new approaches that are there. In the past, regional policy tended to be either a case of that you invested a lot of capital investment in a particular place in the hope that would kind of close employment gaps. That was tended to be the approach. Or alternatively, as was the case really from the 80s onwards, you thought, well, listen, let the market sort it out. It was kind of on your bike and you can move from one place to another. Mobility of labour, mobility of capital, it'll move and there'll be a general equilibrium over the time. That's a fairly crude way of putting both those things, but that was tends to be the approaches. The new approach tends to be, and the plan reflects that, is much more partnership based, and the idea that you're looking at local strengths and sort of local opportunities, and local people are probably best placed to identify some of those. Now there's a lot of strengths with that. At the same time, there's probably some things, I'm happy to kind of come back to those in the questions, but there are some things to be watched out for. One, I would say, is that I could be, as a local person, well equipped to say what's happening in Uri, Mourne and Down now, but my thinking on it might be based on what has happened over the last 30 years. How well equipped I am to think about what the opportunities are for the next 30 years is debatable. So there's a kind of a danger there of vested interests tend to put on the same trajectory, the same sectoral structure as the past. That's one risk with it, I guess, that the local partnership approach can do. Another thing is, so getting fresh voices in that partnership, it would be key. And then the other thing is how that relationship at the partnership level goes with central government, and that's probably another issue to discuss. So I suppose the other thing is whether regional policy can work at all. That's probably the final point I'd make here. The reasons why it generally tends to fail, which is maybe the easier thing to look at, is that generally first, regional policies in the past haven't been pursued with much in the way of vigour. It tends to be short term, they tend to be chop and change. You've levelling up, then you don't have levelling up, all of that type of thing. And there's that danger. You have a spatial plan in the south, which then became decentralisation of public sector jobs to every, people would say to every small town, and that ruined the effect perhaps of that. So there are chopping and changing of things, which tends to mean that it isn't pursued or committed over the long term. Germany's often quoted as a place, and that's certainly in the go big or go home territory, really, of the size of the investment that was done there. And yet 30 years on, there are still, and you can see it just even locally, or even in the most recent election results, there are still parts of eastern parts of Germany, if you travel there, that certainly aren't like Bonn or Hanover or the parts of Western Germany there. So it's a long-term project, I guess, and it's not easy, is the other thing. And I think the other thing I'd just highlight really is that the impact of spatial policies have tended to be, in some cases, outweighed by kind of fiscal policies. One thing I'd highlight there, and it's something Diane Coyle and others have looked at, is that how in the UK, how Green Book appraisals are done is an interesting point to think about here. You're tending then to find that it's like a Matthew principle. Success will follow success. You put money in where you know the return on investment is going to be greatest. That does very little to produce greater convergence between those places that are lagging behind and other places. So even the fiscal point, I suppose, is a key thing. How you solve that, I suppose, is not an easy point, but it is an issue. So I'll leave it there, and happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much. Certainly I know that there will be a lot of questions because you've provided very valuable information, and we want to thank you for the work that you've done already, but also the work, as you've said, that you do with local government. I know that that's invaluable as well to them, informing some of their policies. So I suppose a few questions for me. The first one being, you had mentioned there about sub-regional inequalities widening. Now we know that this committee has a particular interest in looking at regional imbalance. How do we address that? And we know very much that the minister and the department has set, I suppose, a trajectory in terms of plans that they would like to see to try and address these inequalities. I wanted to get a view from yourselves in terms of one of the big issues, and you've touched on this around big announcements, capital announcements. We know the city deal. I speak from my own constituency in Foyle, where there's £300 million of a city deal. In reality, in terms of within our grassroots communities, many of them don't see the benefits of that, certainly not in the short term. And that leads on then to the question around the economic inactivity and how do we go about addressing that particular issue. So I just want to get some thoughts as to, yes, we have the financial investments which sound good and look good, but ultimately to change the trajectory of jobs and economic inactivity as well.
I'll kick off maybe, and Dr. McGuinness can contribute. I suppose the bottom line is the historic or traditional approaches to regional development have failed, and the main reason for that is they've tended to be centrally driven. So what we'd have is, for example, grants given to a company to locate in a disadvantaged area, and there are a number of problems with that. One primary one is that investment tends not to deal with the underlying reasons for that particular area being economically disadvantageous in the first place. And if you have to ultimately give grants to a business to locate in an area, you tend to need to keep giving them grants. They become reliant on grants for them to stay there. And obviously, over a long term, the continuity of that becomes a challenge, and you then see businesses fail or leave those areas after a period of time. So you can see a significant financial investment in an area over a long period of time, but then you're wondering, why have we not seen convergence, or why has that area not economically improved? And so the latest thinking, as Dr. McGuinness referred to, is, well, actually, rather than directing the money centrally or from the centre to the region to give a one-size-fits-all solution, is let's give the money to the region to address the specific challenges that they're facing. So if you have an area that has high levels of economic inactivity, to take your example, that region should be developing very bespoke and tailored solutions to address the challenges in that area. If you deal with those underlying economic challenges and allied to that, try to enhance the economic strengths of each region, so whether it's advanced manufacturing in Mid-Ulster, agri-food in ABC, creative industries in Derry and Strabane, whatever your particular strength is, build on those strengths and address the specific challenges in those areas. And I think what the department, and as we've already said, the approach that the department are taking is consistent with the latest thinking around letting local people identify the solutions for local areas. Now, that said, I do think there does need to be a balance between the sort of central coordination of what's happening across 11 councils and local decision making and local control. So, and I think that'll be worked out, I'm sure, across over the next few years.
Before Dr. The local economic partnerships, do you see that as, well, obviously it's a positive thing, I don't think anybody could take away from that. I suppose that, £45 million over 3 years, do you see, obviously further investments going to be required, but is that a model? I'm conscious of what you said, Dr. McGuinness, around the thinking, and I know there's some fantastic people involved, so this is no slight at all on them, who are doing a fantastic job and have done for many years. I suppose is, how do you bring in, and ensure that there's, I suppose, not the same old either, and that we do have new thinking. So it was just around.
I'll make one comment on the LEPs. So yes, as a general concept, I'm supportive of it. I'm also conscious that there's also labour market partnerships. There's community planning partnerships. Now we've got
strategic growth partnerships.
We now have local economic partners. So I suppose my concern is, are we just creating another piece of infrastructure where it adds to the bureaucracy or the administration of what we're all trying to do, which is to raise the economic prospects of an individual region. One of the points that I'd made to the department, and I think they've gone about it in the correct way, but it was basically the stakeholders who are going to be sitting around the LMP table are going to be the same stakeholders that are sitting around the LEP table. So, and they're going to be dealing with, there will certainly be, there's a Venn diagram in terms of the issues that they're going to be addressing. So would there be a way in which those could be merged, and also to bring in community planning partnerships? So now the approach that the department have taken is, well, okay, let the councils make that call. So if one council wants to merge their LMP and their LEP, fine, let them do that. If others don't, then that's a matter for themselves. I think also it also provides the opportunity for councils either to work on their own, or to move forward with plans for their own specific council area, or for council areas to work together. It could be, for example, in a city deals grouping. So it's about creating a flexibility of approach from an LEP perspective. But to my mind, we need to do it in a way that doesn't add to the administrative infrastructure, let's call it that, around the delivery.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the kind of fresh voices, I suppose where I was going on that is that I'm thinking, you know, I mean, Gareth's right. I can see one or two of the LEPs that have been at, and I've maybe spoken to labour market partnerships in the same council area, and there's an overlap of the personnel there, because there's always going to be an overlap of personnel. There's going to be maybe people from the local FE colleges, or, you know, some of the local chambers, or wherever it might be. I think having something that maybe encourages the LEPs to kind of refresh after a couple of years, to sort of think about who next to bring in, or there kind of other fresh ideas out there, I think would be key. One of the problems, I think, in all of these things, and when you have a kind of a number of organisations or a number of kind of structures in place, your chances of sort of bringing people in who are sort of trying to run a full-time business to do that at the same time is probably not the easiest. Sometimes you're running the meetings during the day, which is not going to suit either. So there's a whole range of challenges there, I think. But my suspicion is, though, that they'll get there in time. I think the fact that probably also that LMPs are set up by one department and LEPs are set up by another means a further, you know, coming together might be challenging again, and there's an ownership issue around that. But I suspect, you know, I do suspect they will get to that place, and hopefully, I think they, knowing themselves locally, if they're aware enough that there needs to be kind of other voices heard, there will mean that there'll be an attempt to kind of widen that out as we go along. In terms of where the LEPs might sit in terms of the kind of skills versus other things, I suppose that's probably where that, not pressure, but that kind of an intention to kind of do joint meetings, or actually maybe join up over time with the LMPs will come, because economic inactivity, you know, is an issue. Skills and qualifications are issues there that the two are trying to deal with in maybe slightly different ways, but there'll be a fair bit of overlap there in terms of that, which will mean, I suspect, in time, you know, that they'll kind of come to the same place and probably the same meetings, really, and maybe take a skills priority in one month and something else in another. How the funding of that is worked out over time, I suppose, is another thing. Yeah,
and before I open up, because we have a full suite of members looking to ask questions, just a final one for now from me. Obviously, this isn't unique to Northern Ireland, as you've said. Across these islands, there's certainly an issue. Countries that have bucked the trend, things that have been done differently, I do think that we obviously need to look at, you know, you've said it clearly, Gareth, that things that have been done in the past haven't worked. That's evident whenever we live within our communities and we see the challenges that exist, you know, in terms of people getting jobs, getting people into jobs, reskilling, all of that. So could you give us maybe just an example of where really positive change has happened, and I suppose what barriers there would be to implementing similar processes or schemes or ideas here in Northern Ireland?
I think when there's two, I suppose the first thing I'd say is there's two types of countries two types of economies that have bucked the trend. One has been on the negative side, I take the negative one first. One has been those countries tend to be mainly in southern Europe, where the growth rate overall has been low, and therefore there's been almost a convergence by kind of, it's not where you want to be, where everybody kind of comes to, we're all poor together.
We're looking for positive examples of those things. People that are worse than us.
Somewhere where we all hang together is probably not where you want to be. But on the positive side, there are those tend to be more positive in these things, but it tends to sort of see countries that have maybe converged, say, from Eastern Europe into the kind of the EU norm. I'm thinking here Croatia, and probably also within that as well, Slovakia as opposed to Czechia. Czechia's divergence has gone one way, Slovakia has gone another, and in both cases, whether this is coincidence or not, but most people seem to see the argument there is at the level of not necessarily, I was saying, decentralisation or devolving of local power making. In one case, it's interesting to see that in one case you had a country where economic development powers were devolved quite fairly heavily in terms of Croatia anyway, and they were kind of sitting there. In the other case, they were centrally then devolved down, but that decentralisation or that devolution of local powers seems to be an issue there. In other places where the issue is more entrenched and it's not a convergent thing, where you're kind of thinking that hasn't worked to the same extent, so it's not a silver bullet is what I would say on that, but it is something that's worth looking at. Just
a quick one then, finally for me, the devolution of powers. Are there any powers do you believe that we should have that would make substantial difference, as in terms of the economic activity piece?
I'm sort of thinking of where in terms of, like, it wouldn't be taxation or anything like that. I think no. I mean, because at the moment, if you think about it, the business rate that you set, there's the central regional rate, and then there's kind of the local government district rate. So it wouldn't really be in that space. It tends to be more in the planning side of things. Now I know again we devolve that out here to the councils. So. Is it a case that that's working, not working? I guess is maybe a question there. But the planning one, I think, is probably more important. In terms of that kind of local development plans and things like that. I think is probably that. Because I think every LEP, all the 11 LEPs, will probably come back to issues around availability of industrial land.
Okay, hand over to Sinead.
Okay. Thank you very much for your report. It's interesting, and I'll probably ask you just what additions you are adding to it. If you've maybe talked to some of those that you haven't. But before that, I just ask you, you said in the report the policies in the past have not been pursued with ambition, vigour or intensity and long-term consistency, and I would totally agree with that. Apart from the Department for Economy, can you identify how other departments are shown ambition, vigour and intensity around regional balance?
That's probably the mastermind pass part of it.
Can we show how they're doing that?
Are they? What examples do you know from, for example, other departments? We'll talk about even economic and activity, which is the Department for Communities, and it is such a pivotal part to play in attaining regional balance, because the disparities are so great. What policies and what intention has been placed on that department to help close the gaps?
Okay, so I think outside of DFE, the two other departments that I think have the biggest role one would be DFC in terms of its responsibility for addressing economic inactivity, and DFI in terms of infrastructure investment. Both, I think, along with DFE, have to work together in order to address regional imbalance. From an infrastructure point of view, I think, that covers a number of areas. One, I think there's transport infrastructure. There is telecommunications infrastructure, particularly around broadband. And the other piece of infrastructure which I bring up at every committee meeting I'm ever at is wastewater infrastructure. And I think that whenever we look at some of those key pinch points on our wastewater, on the wastewater infrastructure map, some of those then are obviously in areas of deprivation. That has a knock-on impact in terms of your ability to attract foreign direct investment. And so those would be, in addition to DFE, the work that DFC are doing around the LMPs, which conceptually is the same approach that DFE are now taking in terms of LEPs. So the work that that DFC are doing around economic inactivity and the work that DFI need to do around infrastructure investment to link areas of economic disadvantage with areas of economic advantage.
So, Gareth, what evidence is there that that is actually happening in relation to policy? Because I do know, economic balance or regional balance is an all-government approach,
yep.
And we all must work together in order to move it forward. And I just want to see the evidence of it as a long-term policy of achieving regional balance. And because we won't do it, I mean, with all the goodwill in the world for it to be one of the 4 visions of the Department for the Economy, it will not happen unless it becomes the priority policy for all of government departments. For example, the Department for Health has a key role to play on regional balance, and it has published a report on health inequalities, and you can map them across some of your report here, just exactly what is happening in terms of health outcomes and economic outcomes. They're not separate.
Yep.
And so where I'm trying to get to is, and I really appreciate that we've got so much data now that we didn't have, but what I'm trying to get to is, how do we make that data actually work in a policy way that moves us forward to closing those gaps?
Yeah, well, I'll say 2 things to that. I mean, first, in terms of what departments are now doing, I think the Department for Communities have been well out the gate in this, because they have the background in community planning, and they also have the labour market partnership, so they've been ahead of this in terms of what that local thinking is. And my experience just in the number of local economic partnerships that have attended the meetings that have been happening, DFC are at the table. The Department for Communities tend to have some, so there's a local presence there, which I think is important. And you can come back to that with Invest NI and the beefing up the regional offices with that, I think, too. Department for Infrastructure, not so much, but I kind of think that's not to the same extent, but it's possibly because somebody would say, well, is it a roads issue, or is it a water issue, or is it this issue, or is it that issue you want to talk to? We can't have somebody there. We're not going to put 4 people in the committee who can talk to each of the 4 things. So who is it you want to speak to? And as the issue comes up, we'll send someone along. Maybe that needs to be addressed by the LEPs, I guess. That's the first thing I'd say. On the second one, in terms of what, and you're right, the public health authorities work there on sort of health inequalities highlights there is an overlap there in terms of the data we have and the or we've produced here and the data they have produced. Probably, if you want my opinion on it, if you're going to get a hold of a government approach to this that takes regional balance seriously, it might be a case of actually having a serious thought been done across the departments of what is best done at a whole of Northern Ireland basis and what is best done at a local issue. We have never really, if you go and you talk to people will say to you generally, listen, Northern Ireland's too small to be worrying about doing that on a local basis. That is generally, a response that you will get, not from every department you speak to or every civil servant by any manner of means, but it's probably a common enough theme that you'll get when you talk to policymakers. And there's probably a lot of things that is actually right for. It's the case of actually deciding what works best at what scale. I'm not sure we've had that discussion. So I think if you have that discussion, a lot of these other things will fall into place. Having that discussion in a serious manner, as opposed to saying everything has to be done at 11 local councils. I would have an argument that some of those local councils, they're not functional economic areas, so why do it at that level?
Yeah.
And in other cases then you can sort of say, well, actually it does better at a city deal.
Just back to your report again. In your report you say almost half of all employee jobs in Northern Ireland were located across 3 LGDs in 2022, with 30% of these located in Belfast alone. And then 1/5 of all employee jobs in Northern Ireland were concentrated in just 6 wards in 2022, 5 of which are in Belfast. That's the scale of the inequalities that we're trying to tackle. And I just think that, government needs to have that ambition in order to do it. And I know you mentioned Germany there, and in Germany they've got a basic law. It's called the Basic Law, and ironically it was the British that helped bring in that British law in 1949 as a result of the end of the war. And that basic law is about the equality. It doesn't matter where you live, you have the equality of living standards right across Germany. And that really stood to them whenever the Berlin Wall fell, because it then had to apply there. And that's why when you go to most of the towns, small towns, far away from the centre, you will have good infrastructure, you will have good investment in your public services, you will have trains and trams and rapid transport infrastructure, no matter where you are. If you're in the rural areas, they still have access to it. And that's the type of ambition that we need to feel and have for a place like Northern Ireland. And of course, we need to have, powers devolved to local areas. But if we don't have a policy, in 2011, there was a nod to it in the Programme for Government, in the draft programme in 2016, in New Decade, New Approach, and nothing has ever changed because it's just short-term. And we need a long-term approach to closing these gaps. And that's, why, the McGee issue of skills is really, really important, because it's skills, it's transport, it's all of those big issues. But it's about how we spend our money in Northern Ireland, and it's about looking at health inequality. So it's a big, big issue, and it has to be done in a policy way where there's a statutory obligation to deliver for all areas.
And I think to go to your your previous question around evidence, I think you could look at the funding or lack of funding for infrastructure investment is a long-standing, multi-decade issue in Northern Ireland. Another point, I suppose, just to draw out about Belfast is larger urban areas in terms of when you have in a developed economy, we've talked about agglomeration benefits. It's those larger urban areas tend to be the areas that are where the high growth sectors locate. So they have an inbuilt economic advantage, as it were. And what we need to and the direction of travel that we wanted to move in is not to disadvantage that, but how can we create local areas or regions that are also attractive for business investment. Mm-hmm. And it's about finding those specific inherent strengths in each of those areas that will attract other businesses. So if we take Mid-Ulster, for example, advanced manufacturing hub, Mid-Ulster also, very few of those jobs came from foreign direct investment. So there is an inherent strength within Mid-Ulster in that area, and that I'm sure that the council are seeking to build on that moving forward. And so it's about, I suppose the challenge for other councils is, well, what's our mega, what's our advanced manufacturing, and how can we create an area that businesses want to invest in, people want to live in?
Have another wee
Go ahead.
Right. You just talked about the Green Book concept, and of the UK, and it's not working for the north of England, for example, the Green Book, because, you know, if you evaluate everything investment-wise based on the Green Book, then the concentration goes to the larger cities like London. And I know that the Metro mayors, for example, are saying, look, this Green Book evaluation on investment is hurting the north of England. I would argue the way we do our business, or, you know, our business cases here in Northern Ireland, and the procurement and all of that is really hurting the smaller the smaller towns and cities outside of the Greater Belfast area as well. Have you any thoughts in relation to that in terms of regional balance?
Well, I think it's kind of now. I think it's sort of well accepted now that as it stands, the Green Book or economic appraisal method more generally, you know, will it is, as I say, it is that, you know, that kind of Matthew principle, you know, there, that, you know, the success will follow success. To those that have, more will be given. To those who don't, good luck and good night, really, in that way. And that's kind of paraphrasing it, but in a way, I suppose the point I'm making there is that that's how the appraisal system is set up as it currently is. It's not necessarily the interpretation or the implementation of that. That's just the system as it is. So you're tending then to, what it tends to mean is that it's much easier to make a case for anything south of Cambridge, really in GB, and the same principle will hold here. I think the key point that Diane Coyle and others who have looked at this have made is that you start to look at how you beef out the strategic context element of the appraisals, and how you start to actually, that doesn't become a cut and paste paragraph that you can just pop in at the start of the thing of here's what economic policy is. I'm saying that as somebody, obviously, of colleagues who teach how to do economic appraisals, and clearly they wouldn't be advising them to do that, but in a way that's often the way you kind of think. You think, what's the policy at the moment? Bang that in, that's the strategic context. If you start to get kind of regional balance and the addressing regional balance into that element of it, I think that's where your key thing. I take your point on what you're saying about the basic law and the statutory thing. I think it's in the implementation of these types of things that it's probably more important, to be fair.
Very briefly, just on, before I took the role in the university, part of my job was completing Green Book appraisals for consultancy firms. I've completed more Green Book appraisals than I care to remember, and we would have said at the time, now this has gone back over 10 years ago now, we would have said at the time that Northern Ireland is Green Book happy. Everything needs a Green Book appraisal, and we were getting paid to complete them, so it was kind of to our benefit, but our view was there are things here where a Green Book is required by the rules, but it's not adding value to the decision-making process. So I would disagree.
Okay. We're going to just bring the conversation back over the line, Shane. We're going to hand over to Lagan Valley MLA David if he wants to.
Well, good to Lagan Valley.
Ask a few questions.
Cheers. Thanks for coming in. I want to look at sort of higher, our broader level, and then I'll come back to Lagan Valley if you fancy. If you take Northern Ireland as a region, we're talking about breaking that down, but if you take it as a region, kind of where do we sit now within the UK regions and within the regions of the south, and is there any movement or any change happening?
In terms of our relative performance, there's been, in terms of our productivity performance, there's been a bit of improvement in recent years. We're still below the UK average. We're still well below the kind of levels in the south. You can argue over GDP and GVA and all those things, but we're still well below that. So there's been a bit of an improvement, but we're still below par. We're above. Obviously, in the labour market things, we're above levels of economic inactivity. We've an employment rate that's slightly lower but improving relative to the UK average as well. In terms of the kind of balance or convergence piece, that's quite interesting. We're in a. I mentioned earlier we didn't want to be in the group of sort of, or follow the example maybe of Southern Europe, but we are in a group there within, if we take it as the other 11 regions in the UK, we tend to be in groups where we're more convergent than other regions in the UK, because we don't have very high performers or very low performers. And I know that people would sort of say, well, with Belfast or with, Ards and North Down, or Derry City and Strabane, depending on what indicator they are at. But they're not outliers in the same extent as they are in, say, Scotland or the northwest of England. So we tend to be in that convergence piece. We tend to be on a par with the likes of Wales, Northeast, and increasingly the Midlands, East and West Midlands. But these are places that are not growing very fast. So this is the real challenge for us. And I know the Minister made the point, and he's right in saying that in the kind of when he was setting out that we need to have a situation where growing our Northern Ireland-wide productivity or competitiveness doesn't impact on, or doesn't mean that we become more regionally imbalanced. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that was the case that was being made. That's the hard trade-off here. If we want to have higher growth and so on and so forth in Northern Ireland, it's how we do that whilst not then diverging further. It's going to be the big thing. But at the moment, that's where we sit. We sit in that group, not growing very fast, but not as divergent as other places.
Okay. In your paper, in the issues to consider, you talk about Belfast that isn't playing the same role as other cities in the UK. You mentioned Manchester, and you mentioned Cork, Limerick, Galway, sort of on the island as well. But can you talk us through, expand on that? Just the thinking behind that and what needs to change?
I suppose that's kind of further what the point I'm making there. I mean, in a way, we kind of see at our local level, when we're looking at it across, the 11 local government districts, we see Belfast is doing, its GVA per capita is well ahead of, the other 11 or the other 10 local government districts, and it's actually, that gap has grown over the last 20 years. And at the same time, in terms of employment rates, in terms of productivity, Belfast is still stuck close to the bottom of UK cities in terms of its performance. So it's improved, but other cities have improved faster. So it's kind of remained sort of not at the bottom, but not far off the bottom. So it's again getting that balance of can we improve Belfast's performance and at the same time ensure other places are coming along well. I think if we look at the south, there's probably good lessons there as to how that's been done. I tend to, when people kind of say, and people maybe go, but I tend to sort of say not Cork or Galway, but look at Limerick for instance, and people sometimes would sort of say Limerick, that doesn't seem to have a great reputation, but Limerick's improvement over the last 20 years has been quite remarkable, really, in terms of attracting investment in. It has issues there in the city, no doubt about that. There's kind of healthcare issues and so on and so forth in terms of public services. But in terms of its kind of economic performance, it's something that you'd be looking at. So it is possible, I think, to have, Dublin's been flying, Cork's been doing very well. Limerick, that hasn't meant that Limerick has fallen off a chart, really, because of that. So there is things there that can be done, I think. And again, I go back to the point there where I kind of think that the LEPs could play a role here. Much of that in Limerick has been to do with kind of local leadership. They've even gone to the extent now of having a mayor, an elected mayor for the city. Not suggesting that, God forbid, we would have something like that for Newry, Mourne and Down, but at the same time, I'm sort of saying, and apologies to anyone that's from there, but I'm not suggesting that that's the thing to do. But I suppose what I'm saying is that thinking about kind of devolving of powers, or thinking about actually the idea that kind of the Sinead McLaughlin mentioned Manchester and the mayors there in Liverpool and Manchester. It's thinking about things like that. Is there ways in which we can kind of beef up how we do things locally?
Yeah. So, what you're saying, Limerick, I'm a massive Ulster Rugby fan, and it's my favourite trip. It's actually because it's a class city. Whenever you go down to the Munster game, and you can see over the years the redevelopment that's happened. So, for the department here, what are the changes, or what are the things that we need to implement to actually start to deliver that you're seeing in Manchester or Limerick, or that we're not seeing?
I think, well, I'll kick off. I mean, for me, how do we make a success of this is basically the question. And there are a number of elements. One is around capacity building within across the 11 councils and the broader LEP stakeholders. And when you have 11 of anything, you're going to have some that perform well and some that need further support. And so I think that ensuring that those LEPs and councils all have the appropriate capacity to identify and develop proposals of sufficient scale that will move the dial in terms of economic rebalancing, and also then from an implementation point of view. So I think there's a capacity point that we need to make sure happens across the piece. In addition to that, I think we need clear metrics. So what does success look like? And what is it that where are we trying to get to? So we've got clear targets. Those individual interventions that the LEPs put in place, they also need to be tracked, monitored, evaluated, so that we can see which interventions are successful and which aren't. And let's stop doing the ones that aren't. Because once we start something, we become loath to stop it. It's human nature, but that's something we need to get better at. There also needs to be cross-council learning. So, it's not like economic inactivity is a problem in one specific council area, but you could have one council area is doing something very novel, innovative in terms of economic inactivity, and it's very successful. And there's another council stroke LEP that's trying to do something in the same space, and they're struggling. Where can the learnings and come across? So I think that it's that capacity piece, it's that monitoring and evaluation piece, and then the ongoing reporting. So you get a state of the region report every year or every 2 years to say this is where we were, this is the progress we've made in the last 2 years. And then I think the final piece is this balance, and I think I said it before, this balance between central coordination and local decision making needs to be achieved. So that collectively, I think that's what's needed to deliver success.
Yeah, I suppose we'll bring it to Lagan Valley, because this is the frustration, absolute frustration I have, and you just nailed that central coordination. So what we have is a council that do have a plan, that have zoned land for capacity, that have all that, but yet we have Invest NI with no land. So if you're talking about capacity, in my area, we have the zoning and the bit that's happened through the LDP, and all of that has happened, yet the central, if you like, departments haven't followed that through with owning and purchasing that land to allow that to be realised. And that is, so how do you nail that? The local council, whenever they get it right, and our economic guys are great there, when they get it right, it's coming from the department here. How do you marry that and bring that together?
So the principle is partnership. Mm-hmm. And so partnership doesn't just mean coordination from the top down, but an equal. So if your LEP identifies these specific issues that need addressed at the central government level, there's a mechanism where that flows back. So I think it's not so much, will the department just set the policy and they'll issue the instructions. It has to be a two-way flow of equals, where responsibility sits in both central and local government areas. So it's about making that partnership work, really.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Mayor Honeyford, no?
There's as much chance that happens.
There's some good ideas and certainly a discussion. Padraig, online.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for your presentation and your answers so far. It's been really informative. And I suppose just to build on the points that you've already raised, I wanted to touch on a couple of issues. Just checking you can hear me okay? Yeah, sorry, my signal keeps stopping on and out. So it was just around the potential of an all-Ireland economy, and I suppose cross-border initiatives, particularly I'm thinking the Northwest City region, the Derry, Letterkenny Economic Corridor, and so on. I suppose it's just to get an assessment from yourselves of what role these can play in actually addressing regional disparities firstly, but also what policy or how policy, I suppose, can support that and be developed around that. And therefore, is that something that should be replicated across other parts of the country as well?
Well, I think I'll start perhaps, and then Owen can follow. So I think there certainly is potential for cross-border cooperation. I think the border counties in Ireland also tend to be facing many of the similar economic challenges as many of the councils in Northern Ireland. So there's scope certainly there for partnership working. And I think, again, the flexible approach that the department have put forward in terms of their sub-regional economic plan, allowing individual councils and LEPs the flexibility to develop partnerships with who they want. So we have talked, and perhaps I've talked in the examples that I have given about how councils in Northern Ireland could cooperate with each other. There's absolutely no reason why Derry and Strabane and Donegal, for example, shouldn't be working on joint projects. I think also with funding from, say, for example, the Shared Island Fund is also available where that sort of partnership working is encouraged and funding is available for it. So I think I'm not, and it's not for us to put forward specific proposals about what should happen. But as a principle, that should be, the flexibility should be there in the system to allow that.
Maybe just add, Pádraig, to that. I mean, I think the other, if it was to kind of look at a challenge that's there at the moment for that operating, it's not so much at whether, you know, the local institutions can cooperate or do cooperate. I think you know, right along the border, the councils tend to be doing that already, or, you know, as you mentioned, they're in the northwest of the Dublin-Belfast economic corridor. There's a fair bit of cooperation in that space. One of the things I think is an interesting one, and it was highlighted relatively recently, and that is the fact that we have a larger pool of people now who are working cross-border in terms of kind of cross-border labour mobility than we had, say, 20 years ago, but it's nowhere near what we would expect it to be, given, you know, how the southern economy has grown. You would have expected to be much more, and I think, you know, be it in the northwest, I'm always struck by the fact that when you look at the northwest commuting flows, given how Letterkenny's been flying in the last 10 or 15 years, you would expect a much bigger outflow out of Derry City and Strabane, and indeed even some of the other council areas up to jobs around Letterkenny. Much of the flow is going in the opposite direction, largely for public sector work. So it's an interesting thing, and I think one of the key things that has been highlighted by people who are looking at that space is the continuing difficulties actually for people who look to take up an opportunity across the border in terms of labour mobility. Now, maybe we would look at it as, oh, that's grand because it doesn't mean our workforce goes away and our workforce is tighter here, but there's skills that can be picked up. There's all sorts of things. There's kind of wage opportunities that can be brought, and probably even more importantly, if you're trying to attract people into some of the border areas, the fact that maybe a family can move there and a partner can move across, can work across the border in another job is key to that. So I think there's a number of issues there, but that key issue around tax, pensions, social security, we haven't moved as far as I think we can or should have in the last 20 years. It seems to me we've moved from a situation where the jobs weren't visible, the opportunities weren't visible, to now realising that they're visible, but the challenges haven't really been addressed. So I think that is an important one.
Anything controversial there that made Pádraig disappear. I think he just lost signal. Yeah. So no doubt Pádraig will listen back to what you've said, and I think he's going to try and rejoin. So we'll come back to him if there's any further questions. But we're going to move over now to Emma.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you both for the presentation and for the written briefing. Really interesting. Delighted to hear Mid-Ulster's already been mentioned. So, I suppose a lot of what I wanted to delve into has kind of been covered by other contributors this morning and yourselves around that whole, I mean, the point that you made about Mid-Ulster is what we're hearing from local businesses and from everybody that's involved in Mega already around the sort of indigenous businesses that we have, and that heavy focus on construction and heavy engineering and manufacturing, and, you know, the success of people in spite of a lack of infrastructure and a lack of state support historically and in the past, and all of that to be considered in terms of our proximity to the border and, you know, the geography of the area. I just wanted to ask around, because some of the statistics that you provided in the report was really interesting in highlighting, the productivity, the level of people of work in our area. The fact, I'm always getting this from the Chief Executive or Council around the fact that we're only second behind Belfast, but then the standard of jobs and the median wage were a wee bit behind. And I know there's a focus from the department on regional balance and also on good jobs, and obviously legislation coming forward there, and the link between people having security and contentment in their workplace and then productivity. And I wondered if you would go further into that point specifically.
There's quite a bit there. I mean, I think that, I suppose when I look at Mid Ulster, a lot of the success of that area is very much driven indigenously. So it's been driven by the leadership, for the want of a better word, in that area, and that is across the council, it is across the business community, and it's across education institutions. And so what we see Ulster University working with the local FE college to help to deliver very specific tailored programmes for businesses in that area. And one of the key benefits that comes out of that then is you then create a cluster that is attractive for other companies to want to invest in that area. So I think that that's kind of one of the first important things. In particular, in the sectors that are strong within the Mid Ulster area, they tend to be higher productivity sectors and increasingly higher skilled jobs required. So that's a long-term journey that manufacturing has been on. So historically, it would have been relatively low skills or qualifications, but they're very much moving up the skills ladder as it becomes more technologically advanced. And so what we tend to see is that people employed in higher skill or higher qualification jobs tend to have higher levels of job satisfaction and tend to earn more. And I'm sure those two things are linked as well. But so therefore, it's about trying to harness that as much as possible. So if you've got high skilled, high paid people in jobs where they're reasonably content, that in turn then has a positive impact on productivity. With that, you then have greater levels of wealth from an industry level, from a firm level, to increase investment. And you create a virtuous cycle, if you like. And I think that, so the challenge for Mid Ulster is we're doing well, we're directionally correct. How do we keep going? What's the next step? And I think for me, that's the direction of travel for Mid Ulster.
Thanks.
One thing I would add to that, and it's something we were chatting beforehand, something we were hoping to look at a wee bit more this year is around kind of pay setting or wage setting, across the north and in different areas, just to see how that's done and what are the kind of the factors that lead companies to offer different kind of levels of pay and different, sometimes for a similar job in a different place type of thing. So how they judge the local market and what that'll bear is an important point. I think interestingly as well, it's an interesting point Gareth has made there. It's the next level. I think when you kind of look at the Mid Ulster performance over the last 20 years and particularly really in the recovery after the crash in 2008-9, which was quite remarkable in terms of its recovery since that. Probably the median wage element of that, it's kind of, now other local, when you look at the figures, other local government districts would take your right arm off for having the performance that Mid Ulster has, but that's an interesting one where that's going to dip back into the pack. I not knowing it and not wanting to say too much on it, but I wonder how much that is where either the size of firms or the local labour market means that there's not as many top salary jobs dragging that median up a little bit, so that's an interesting thing to kind of look at in that council area. Is it's the distribution of wages, if you like, within Mid Ulster could be an interesting point to look at. So in a sense, what does wage setting look like locally, and is it slightly different to what it might be in Belfast or Fermanagh and Omagh or another place. But it's a good point to make, actually, because that is the one area that it's been, below par, if you like.
Yes. I have just one more question, I suppose, and it relates to the point yourselves and David were discussing, and the sort of the last wee section of the briefing paper around this trade-off between, the region of the North as a whole, and then, if you're going to prioritise regional imbalance. And it was something I was thinking about. I didn't see it as obvious as that, because I suppose the rising tide should lift all boats, and we have that even set out in the PFG around the fact that the North as a whole might be doing well, but that doesn't mean that areas haven't been falling behind. And it ties into we have Mega as a very well established cluster in our area, but we've also got a tourism cluster emerging and doing really well at the minute, and it's one of the industries that, because I suppose of our geography, it hasn't been as obvious for us, and how we bring that up, and it's a different type of job, and the hospitality sector and all of the challenges that they're facing. So I suppose it's just about how we can specifically ensure that it doesn't, we don't have to prioritise one to the negligence of the other. Basically.
And that's the key. Challenge. So it's not like Belfast is this superstar performer where if it can become more competitive, we would rather stop that. There's a lot of upside potential for Belfast, and I think obviously InvestNI now have their revised target for 65% of FDI to be outside the greater Belfast area, and I think again that's something that directionally we would support, but rather than having to add or give added incentive for businesses to locate in areas outside of Belfast, we want to be creating areas outside of Belfast where businesses, that's their first choice. It's not, well, our preferred choice is the Greater Belfast area, but if we can get additional funding, we'll go somewhere else. It's, no, actually that other location suits our business best. And I think, from an InvestNI perspective and their new regional offices, if the LEPs and each of the local areas can develop 2 or 3 specific clusters, different clusters, but clusters each, then the InvestNI local or regional offices can then start to focus on trying to attract foreign direct investment to fit those clusters, rather than who's out there, let's try to get them into Northern Ireland. So they're targeting, they can target more sector-specific companies to from an FDI perspective.
Okay.
Thank you. Before we go to Diana, I'm just going to bring Padraig back in, but I don't know how much you heard of the answer.
No, look, I didn't get most of it, but to be honest, I'll watch it back and maybe touch base offline on that as well. Really appreciate your answer to the first part. So it was just, I actually wanted to touch on productivity, but in a different sense. So the move, obviously, towards looking at productivity in terms of measuring it by GVA. I suppose it's to get your assessment of the benefits of that. How does that change things? I met with InvestNI this week, and I suppose one of the positives which I see is the alignment between department strategy and Invest strategy in terms of measuring productivity, because I think that that's essential and should always have been the case, I suppose. But in terms of going forward, this is one of the huge differentials which sets our economy apart from other economies. So how important do you think actually how we measure productivity in terms of the GVA is, and how does that potentially, how is that going to change our figures and our readings of productivity going forward?
Well, I think I suppose there's the 2 ways of measuring productivity using GVA. One is, by every job that's filled. The other is by every hour we work. And it's an interesting one. It's a strange one, but there you have it. The North tends to do better when we measure by the hours we work than by the jobs we fill. If you're talking about the relative productivity to other parts of the UK or other parts of the south of Ireland, it's the same thing. We're kind of better at one than we are at the other. Now, why that is so, I suppose, is a whole other argument. But I think I would agree with you entirely. I think the idea of starting to kind of try and understand, it's the best measure to try and understand how local economies are performing. There's no question about that. We've had it in the past where it was, and I understand why that was the case, be it IDB or Ledu or Invest NI more in more latter decades. There were job creation agencies, really, because it was an unemployment issue. Here was the primary one. We've now moved from that. It's not to say that job creation isn't important, but it's the quality of the jobs and the quality of the firms that we're looking to kind of create here, either indigenously or attract here through FDI. So, and productivity is, in my view, the only measure that works for that in terms of, there's the phrase that's always used, in the end, in the long run, productivity is the main thing that matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I agree with everything Owen has said. The other point that I would make just is that you got to be consistent. Just whatever the measure is, stick with the measure, and then you can track your progress. But the only way that the likes of Invest NI can increase our average productivity is if they target above average productivity jobs, just in terms of the mathematics of how productivity works. So that means they will be targeting higher skilled, higher qualified, and also higher paid jobs. And I think that, again, directionally, that's where we need to be. That in turn, however, does put increased responsibility or emphasis on our education institutions, universities, on the FE colleges, to ensure that we make the most of the labour force and the working age population here.
Yeah, and I suppose it interfaces very neatly with the Good Jobs Bill, as Emma's mentioned. All these components are going to increase the productivity and work together to do that. But just a final kind of point on that, I suppose, in terms of looking at the South and looking at how other economies measure productivity as well, I'm just keen to understand, while, as we've all touched on, it's a welcome development that we're moving towards GVA, could that potentially skew our understanding? So if we're to look at productivity figures over recent years and then look at them from this measure is implemented, how do you think that the department need to work to ensure that actually they're matching up our previous measure of productivity with the new measure of productivity, which is going to come in, to ensure that there's consistency in our understanding? Because obviously, if we're looking at two different measurements, that could skew our understanding as a committee and anybody's understanding reading it. So how do we link that up to ensure that there's clarity in terms of our measurement of success and whether or not we're meeting it?
Well, there's good news, I think, on that. I mean, we've tended to use, and I think we've tended to use, or we're now tending to use kind of GVA as the measure, as the output measure, as opposed to GDP. And I actually think that's a better one. I think in the South they're starting to move towards that as a productivity measure as well, increasingly, so that relative performance should become a little bit, and it's a good thing in a sense, because it strips out a lot of the transfer pricing and some of the other issues there around GDP figures in South. Or you're going with, is it GNI or modified domestic demand, or the list is endless really of the measures you would be using for that. So I think GVA is a good thing. It also will allow that comparability across OECD large and small regions, which I think is a good thing, because in some senses we can often be in the danger of kind of comparing apples with oranges, really, of where, given Northern Ireland's size and all of those sorts of things, what is it we should be, in a sense, comparing ourselves, or what size of a place we should be comparing ourselves. So I think the GVA is a move to that. The only challenge, I guess, in that is going to be that we're always going to be looking at it, but it's the nature of statistics, a year or two behind. So you'll have somebody in a while saying, why can't we have more timely GVA figures? That'll be the next argument. But I think moving to something that we can all agree on is certainly a very good first step.
Yeah, no, look, thanks for your answers to those questions, and I will listen back. Apologies, my signal's all over the place today, so we'll listen back and maybe touch base on some of the answers you've raised in your initial questions. So thanks very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Diana.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation this morning. It's been very, very interesting, and all the contributions. The one thing I wanted to touch on was automation. And automation will drive efficiencies and drive productivity. But the OEDC research found that Northern Ireland was the region to be most at risk in terms of job losses. And I'm thinking of those regions like my own in the west, in the southwest, of manufacturing and agri-foods. And how do you see, the successor to the job losses, where those jobs are going to come from in regions like that are heavily dependent on manufacturing and agri-foods?
So it's a good question, and it's an area that this automation is something that's been happening for hundreds of years. I think it's taken on a new light now with artificial intelligence and the different sectors that are impacted there. I suppose what I would say in general about automation is, when I mentioned very briefly in my opening statement that I had done some work on demographics more recently, and what we're seeing there is an increasingly tight labour market, and we're also entering an era, agree or disagree, but we're entering an era where immigration has become much more of a sensitive issue, and the access that the likes of manufacturers and agri-food, for example, had to Eastern European labour is a time of the past. So that adjustment, where you have reduced access to labour, requires businesses to go down the automation route. And what I think is, I do think that manufacturers in particular are probably reducing or lowering their recruitment expectations. That's not because they want to recruit less people, but it's because they can't find enough people to fill vacancies. So I see primarily, and this is obviously just initially, and we need to see how things play out, but my initial assessment of the situation is that automation is going to be required for those manufacturers to continue to grow and become efficient and be more productive. That's the direction of travel they now need to go down, because they can't access as much labour as before. That for me doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to see anything like significant numbers of job losses. It may be a much more managed reduction, but that's simply because they can't replace people, as opposed to having to shed staff. So I'm probably a little bit more optimistic than the OECD report that you referenced in terms of jobs at most risk. And so to wind back a little bit, AI is coming now at a time where it's going to take white-collar jobs rather than what would have historically been blue-collar jobs. And the likes of accountancy now is under significant risk from AI, apparently. But when I look at the demographics data, I'm less worried about, is AI going to take all the jobs, and I'm more concerned about, is AI going to come soon enough to fill the jobs that we don't have the people to fill anymore. So I kind of see that automation AI journey as something that will grow productivity. Relatively speaking, fewer jobs, but that's a factor of demographics rather than a significant any sort of increase in unemployment.
Just maybe going off at a tangent, I was reading Conor Patterson's report that he presented to us. He talked about FDI being in decline. Do you see FDI being in decline, particularly for we have an ambition to have more FDI in Northern Ireland?
I haven't looked at FDI in some time.
Geopolitical kind of
environment
we're in.
I think, well, just yesterday, I read, now this is UK-wide, the UK, and was talking now, it's historic data, I think it goes back to the middle of last year, and the 12 months to June of 2024, the UK attracted the second most greenfield foreign direct investment in the world after the US. In value terms. Now, a lot of that was around data centres, which is very high value and perhaps not huge numbers of employment. there will be this drive to, if you're reliant on US foreign direct investment, I think the direction of travel certainly suggests that there will be reshoring of jobs back to the US. That could, but that's going to work two ways as well, because the reshoring and the shortening of supply chains is a trend that we've seen since the pandemic, and so what could happen also is reduced levels of Western companies investing in Asia, for example, and if they're wanting to sell into the European Union market, to locate in the European Union or in the single market in Northern Ireland. So I would say that the FDI market, for the want of a better phrase, is changing. Where FDI will come from may be different. I mean, we've tended to be more reliant on American FDI, but we may need to open up to other areas such as European foreign direct investment.
Would that be a recommendation from you to invest NI into agencies like that?
So, well, yeah, I mean, we would need to do further research to confirm that. That's my sense, but that would certainly be an expectation that Invest NI would be already looking at that, because I know that they're also doing work around taking full, and this is something that, well, perhaps we all should have moved faster on, but are taking full advantage of the Windsor Framework. So regulatorily, if that's a word, we are unique. And we like to think that we're unique in lots of ways. I'm not sure we are, but we are regulatorily, I've made myself say it again, unique from a Windsor Framework perspective. So there will be some sectors that we are best placed in the world for a business to locate, and I think we need to make more of that.
Okay, finally, Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. Just checking you can hear me.
We can indeed.
Thanks. It was just a brief follow-up in relation to your answer to Emma about the relationship between skills and job creation, and in terms of even satisfaction. Did I take from it that you meant that that largely applies to highly skilled employment as opposed to lower skilled jobs? And I think predominantly of where there is environments such as hospitality environments, where essentially it's strong local businesses driving a push towards skilled labour in those particular fields in given areas. Is that also a factor, or is it largely just in relation to your coordination between employment and skills? Is that just for highly skilled jobs?
No, so I think in general it's people in higher skill, better paid jobs have higher levels of satisfaction than people in lower skill jobs. You've raised an interesting point in terms of the hospitality sector, which tends to, because of the nature of the employment and hospitality sector, it tends to be larger numbers of younger people for a relatively short period of time. So people from their late teens to their mid-20s, who predominantly work in hospitality. That's a very important sector for those young people to develop the skills. A lot of them then are developing the skills before they, as part of, when they're going through their university or whatever it should be. So I wouldn't want to start to pick out individual sectors where low levels of job satisfaction, and I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the case within hospitality, but certainly at the overall macro level, higher skilled, higher qualified people tend, and part of that's job satisfaction and having agency and those types of factors.
And can I ask you, and I've seen this in Craigavon, where you have some very strong businesses, particularly pharmaceutical companies. You see in Mid-Ulster some of the manufacturing. I've seen in Ballymena, whether it's through the innovation with Wrightbus or indeed even Galgorm in the hospitality sector. Is the drive, the skills drive, which is creating the rise in employment in those particular sectors in areas, is that being driven largely by individual businesses or by government?
I think it's most likely it's been driven by the market. I think so. For example, if we take the Galgorm group, what we're seeing is for a lot of hospitality businesses, they're wanting to move up what's called the value chain. And so it's about providing a higher quality hospitality experience for more discerning, whether it's tourists or local people. With that higher quality hospitality experience comes a higher skill level. So you can't just bring someone who's 17, 18 and put them into a 5-star hotel, for example. There is a training period required. So I think that for some sectors, it's very much market driven and firm driven. I would say that the likes of FE colleges, for example, and higher education institutions are very much part of that process in terms of helping to deliver hospitality type courses. So I think it's primarily a market for hospitality. It's primarily a market driven feature.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Look, thank you both for taking the time. We have obviously spent quite a bit of time through a lot of questions, so we really do thank you. Shows the interest, of course, of members in this particular area. It's no doubt not the last time we're going to hear from you. We'll hear from you again. But again, thank you for your time and for the effort that you've put in to brief us as a committee.
Thanks very much.
Oh, sorry, apologies. Sinead.
I have an observation to make just regarding your paper. And it was figure 1 and figure 2. It's really hard to see and to understand. And 3 of the council areas, to me, have the same colour.
Yeah.
And the blacks and the purples, and they're all going into one. So just, in your final document, would you look at those two graphs, because they're not
It is
making
difficult, yeah.
they're not
Which is
making
why we
sense.
put the tables in. But yeah, no, it's a fair comment.
Is that
It's a fair
okay?
comment.
Yeah.
Fair
Okay,
comment.
just
It's even more difficult when your printer's black and white.
Just looking
Which
at
is
that.
very hard as I try to decipher the
I
different
can
shades
only
of.
see it when I'm pressing it up and zooming it out, and it's still very difficult.
And I
So
would just
Let me
say
say
now,
there's
you
about
would
50
look at it
shades,
that way when it is printed out in black and white. Good luck with reading that. Thank you.
okay,
So
right.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Really appreciate that. Okay, members, we have went over slightly just in terms of time. What we're going to do briefly is sum up with the clerk in terms of some actions. I was going to suggest that we take a few moments as a bit of a comfort break just before we bring the utility regulator and his colleagues in. So if, clerk, could you maybe just sum up briefly?
Didn't think there were any actions. We're going to have the UEPC back with us again to talk about the skills barometer later on, and I'll just follow up with them about. It says in the skills barometer that they're looking to provide further information with a sub-regional breakdown.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'll ask them about. Is committee content for me to just follow up with them in that regard,
Yeah.
Chairperson?
Right.
Is that our action? Right.
Okay. Members, we're going to just take a few minutes recess if we can. Just if we come back maybe at 11:40, if that's okay.
I have to drop off at 12:15, and I know Padraig's already away, so just.
Okay, so we're just on our 5. If members can just stay with us to the bitter end, if they.
Committee Room 30. Sound. 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 Committee Room 30, 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 Sound.
Hey, members, we're back in public session. We're just going to jump now and deal with the correspondence of item number 8, just to dispose of those. Members, you will see from your meeting packs, page 258, there is an index of the correspondence provided. Members, if there's agreement, I think that we could deal with those as a block, unless any members has any particular issues. Are people happy to dispose of those as outlined in the index?
Is that agreed, members?
Members
Yeah.
content?
That's fab.
Okay.
Jump back to 7.
Okay, let us go back then to item number 7. We're going to invite the utility regulator and his team to join us. Okay, members, can I welcome John French, the Chief Executive Officer, the Utility Regulator, Peter Russell, Elaine Cassidy, John Mills and Colin Broomfield. You're all very welcome to the committee, and apologies for the slight delay in the indicative times, but we had an interesting session previously as well. I'm sure this one will just be as interesting. I'm going to hand over to yourselves. I'll give you a few moments there just to settle, but hand over to yourselves maybe just to give some introductory remarks, and then we're going to open up to members for some questions. So thanks for taking the time today. We look forward to hearing from you. John?
And thanks very much for the opportunity to come today. I'm John French, Chief Executive at the Utility Regulator. I don't know if you just want to introduce yourselves. Elaine?
Yeah, I'm Elaine Cassidy. I'm Director of Price Controls in the Utility Regulator.
Peter Russell, I'm Executive Director for Price Controls Networks and Energy Futures.
I'm John Mills. I'm the Head of Electricity Price Controls, which means I had operational responsibility for RP7.
And I'm Colin Broomfield, Director of Markets at Utility Regulator.
Okay.
And then, so thanks very much for the opportunity to attend the committee today and provide you an overview of the 7th price control for Northern Ireland electricity networks. But first of all, I thought it would be just useful to provide an overview of the work of the Utility Regulator. So we are a non-ministerial government department. Our role is set out in statute. We're accountable to our board, which is publicly appointed, and the Northern Ireland Assembly. Our statutory role is to economically regulate gas, electricity, water and sewerage services here in Northern Ireland. And we're the only multi-sectoral economic regulator in the UK covering both energy and water. Legally, we are a creature of statute, so we can only do things that we're empowered to do by legislation. Therefore, our role is limited by the laws that created the organisation. Unlike ministerial government departments, we do not possess the royal prerogative, and therefore we can only do what is set out in legislation. Our role is set out in 5 primary pieces of legislation. For electricity, this is the Energy Order 2003. This order established the utility regulator in its current form and sets out our overarching objectives in relation to the performance of our duties in electricity and gas. Then there's the 92 Electricity Order, which is the principal order for our electricity functions. The Electricity Single Markets Order of 2007, which sets out the arrangements under which the utility regulator, together with the Irish regulator, are jointly responsible for the regulation of the single wholesale electricity market on the island of Ireland. Then for natural gas, we are governed by the Electricity Order 1996, which sets down our functions for gas. And finally, for water and sewerage, our remit is set out by the Water and Sewerage Services Order of 2006. These 5 pieces of legislation set out that our primary duty is to promote and protect the short and long-term interests of consumers here. Our role is to make sure that energy and water companies in Northern Ireland are regulated in line with our statutory duties. For us to be successful as a regulator, we must have a clear legislative mandate, that we held ourselves democratically accountable, as we're doing today, and that we follow due processes. As an organisation, it is important that we have the knowledge and skills to exercise expert judgment, and that we are effective and produce the desired effects that the legislative mandate set out for us. As a regulator, one of our main statutory tools is to set price controls for monopolistic regulatory companies in Northern Ireland. Setting price controls is one of the most significant activities that we carry out. Price controls are used to set the amount that a regulated company can charge its consumers for the service they provide. We act as pseudo-competition for monopoly-type companies. In setting price controls, we follow international agreed best practice. Our task is essentially to implement a framework with which we provide the monopoly company with a return for them providing an acceptable quality and level of services. In return, the company receives a reasonable assurance of the revenues that they will get, and this is to cover their efficient costs and ensure fairness for the consumer. So that's in terms of background. But turning on to RP7 specifically, the Northern Ireland Electricity Networks is responsible for building and maintaining the electricity transmission and distribution networks, which allows consumers to access a secure supply of electricity. Due to its status as a natural monopoly, Northern Ireland Electricity Networks is subject to economic regulation, which protects electricity consumers by ensuring a quality service is delivered at a balanced and reflective cost. As I've mentioned already, RP7 is the 7th regulatory price control for NIE networks. It will run from April this year to March 2031. In this price control, we have allowed for £2.23 billion worth of investment over the next 6 years for the operation and expansion of the electricity grid. This is the largest investment in the history of Northern Ireland's grid infrastructure. It sets out an investment journey that will pave the way forward for an improved electricity system, but this is a long-term investment journey. We've increased the amount of allowances that were available for network investment in RP6, and this will continue into the RP8 and RP9 price controls to ensure Northern Ireland has the grid infrastructure it needs to meet net zero targets and government's statutory emissions and renewable targets. The RP7 final determination set out how much money Northern Ireland Electricity needs to operate their business, what they need to deliver a smarter, more flexible, more integrated electricity system to maintain the security of supply within the electricity network in Northern Ireland, and also to build new infrastructure to ensure that electricity gets to homes, businesses and transport where it is needed. Typically, a price control process takes a number of years to develop. The RP7 process began with the publication of our consultation and approach document back in March 2022. Then NIE Networks provided us with their business plan in March 2023, which set out their plans and expenditure requests for the RP7 price control period. We assessed the company's plans for the development and operation and maintenance of its network, considering consumers' needs, and we published our draft determination for public consultation on the 28th of November 2003, and then our final determination was made on the 30th of October last year. We are very aware that this is a significant investment in Northern Ireland's grid infrastructure. As part of any price control process, we scrutinise and benchmark the company's costs to ensure they are efficient, and every pound of investment we approve represents value for money for consumers both today and tomorrow. Following this scrutiny, we identified £322 million worth of savings, which was a 12.6% reduction in what Northern Ireland Electricity Networks originally requested in their business plan. The network element of a bill is approximately a quarter of the overall bill. The RP7 price control investment will impact on network charges depending on a consumer's consumption. Each consumer will be impacted differently depending on their individual circumstances. A domestic customer who does not change their electricity uses or needs shouldn't see any material change in the network element of their bill. But customers who choose to adopt low-carbon technologies such as electric vehicles or heat pumps will see an increase in line with their increased consumption. And larger consumers will see the greatest percentage increase as they are connected to the higher voltage transmission network, and there will be proportionally a greater investment at this level within this price control. Within the price control, we have also asked NIE to increase the consumer support measures they bring in, and we've asked them to gain the internationally recognised ISO standard for consumer vulnerability. So overall, we are completely focused on enabling electricity, gas, water and sewage companies that we regulated to be best in class. We continuously work to ensure that consumers are protected, while also ensuring the right levels of investment is in place to support the delivery of the Government's Climate Change Act targets, Northern Ireland Executive's energy strategy, and that we work within our statutory mandate. I'm very happy to take questions on that today.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John, and to your colleagues for coming along today. That was a very useful briefing, and as I say, we do thank you, and a lot of information there to take in, and no doubt we will hopefully over the course of the next while be able to tease out some of the key issues. I suppose one of the questions that I want to begin with is in relation to, it'll be no surprise, in relation to consumer support and Storm Eowyn and some of the challenges that existed. But can I first of all say and to thank you for the role that you've played publicly in terms of trying to provide that reassurance to people, and even in terms of the processes. I think that that's vitally important, so thank you for that. One of the things that we tried to tease out a couple of weeks ago from the department was in relation to some statements made by the Economy Minister in relation to compensation being provided. She had indicated that there was agreement in principle that compensation would be provided, and the department, when they were in front of us at the committee, were unable to maybe provide that clear or that clarity as to who that agreement in principle was with. So I just wanted to ask yourself as the regulator whether you were, and I'm aware of what you've said publicly, but in terms of were you privy to any of those conversations where such agreements were made in principle?
No. So we're very clear that there was 3 routes and maybe a mixture of those routes as a fourth option, that compensation goodwill payments could be paid. There was a regulatory route, government could have paid for it, or NIE could choose off their own back to pay for it. Unfortunately, we can only look at it through a regulatory lens. There is no legislation currently in place to enable that payment to be made through a regulatory process. But yeah, that's all I can.
No, I welcome your clarification. I just wanted to understand whether or not you were privy to those conversations, and it's clear that you weren't. In terms of going forward then, an RP7 takes account of Storm Isha. That's correct? Yeah, in terms of Storm Isha, RP7 has taken account of Storm Isha and obviously network damage costs. Going forward, is there going to be a reflection of Storm Eowyn?
Yeah, so from what we understand from NIE, the cost of Storm Eowyn is about £15 million to repair the network. RP6 is where the current price control runs up to the end of this month, so it will be under the rules of RP6 that Storm Eowyn will be done. But John might want to say more on around the increased investment and what that will bring in terms of increased resilience within RP7. But the Storm Eowyn costs will be dealt with under the current price control that finishes at the end of this month.
So within the existing price control in RP6, we always provide an allowance for dealing with storm events, which is generally based on the historic average of the previous period that we can take account of. That will usually, because of the way we do price controls, lap over about half one price control and the next. So when we updated for RP7 in the final determination, we updated that allowance to account of Storm Aisha. And it's therefore then up to the company to work within those allowances within RP7. When we get to RP8, we will go through the same process. We will look back at what the costs have been over the recent past and adjust allowances in RP8 for that.
Okay, thank you. And a final question for me for now. In the Assembly, certainly this week, but over many weeks, there's been a focus on green growth and moving in that direction. One of the assumptions that clearly has been made in RP7 is around the increased use of electric vehicles, heat pumps, etc. If that doesn't materialise, and I can only go anecdotally on what I see and hear on the ground in terms of uptake of EV vehicles and all of that, how big of an assumption is that, and how will then that affect, in terms of the customers' bills? How will that have an impact in terms of the pricing?
Yeah. I can start on that, maybe John come in. So yeah, the business plan for RP7, so for that 6-year period, there are assumptions in there. Yeah. So, for example, in EVs, it was assuming 300,000 EVs, 120,000 heat pumps. If you look at the Committee for Climate Change's work and other bodies that have looked into this, you know, in terms of EVs, maybe they're talking about 257,000 instead of 300,000.
Yeah.
You know, so maybe the same ballpark. Heat pumps might be slightly different, but really this is to get the network where it needs to be to deliver the executive's energy strategy.
Yeah.
So, you know, that was published December 21 and set out that ambition. RP7 is an enabler of that. So to facilitate the transition to those low carbon technologies, the network has to be there. So it has to be there in advance of need. So we've assessed NIE's approach and we agree with it, and that's why those assumptions were put in there. But the assumptions are, you know, you can debate assumptions, but the principle is investing ahead of that need so the network is there.
That is prepared that in the case of 300,000 vehicles being available, there's a capacity there to...
So the impact on
meet
consumers
demand.
then, you know, if you don't change what you're doing, the impact on your bill is not really is negligible.
Right.
If you are going to uptake EVs and heat pumps, then your bill will go up, but you're using more electricity, so you're saving on home heating oil or you're saving on petrol and diesel. You know, so that's the kind of trade-off in the RP7 price control. But John can maybe go into a bit more detail.
I think it's Peter's sort of describing to you as one of the fundamental challenges of investing in electricity networks going forward. It's that balance of uncertainty as to what the future will look like, and the fact that if we're not prepared, we actually delay and prevent the implementation of things I think that we all agree are necessary, which is to reduce carbon. So we're having to make decisions in RP7 to project into the future, and those decisions will be uncertain. It's one of the reasons we set out in consultation what we want to do, and it's one of the issues we highlighted in our draft determination consultation, this uncertainty. But assuming that we are on a trajectory for electric vehicles, I wouldn't necessarily focus too hard on the 300,000, because if it isn't 300,000 by 2031, it's probably going to be 300,000 by 2033, because this will be an upward accelerating trajectory. And that idea of not being behind this curve, I think, is vitally important to us. You did ask the question essentially on the impact of tariffs if things don't materialise. And that is a risk in this process, and it's a risk we all bear as a community on that investment. We looked at it in the final determination and what would happen if, you know, only 75% of the EV uptake materialised in that time, and I think we went for half the heat pump scenario. We can be sure it's not going to be nothing. That's the thing we can be sure of. And in those cases, there'll be quite small increases in bills. But again, as people uptake further electric vehicles and use more electricity to fuel them, that impact on a tariff per kilowatt hour is constrained, but your electricity bill will go up because you're using more electricity. But as John was saying, what you're doing is you're offsetting that increase in your electricity bill as an alternate form of fuel to your car or your heating bill.
Thank you. Emma?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to you all for coming today and for the paper that you provided. The Chair touched upon the sort of situation with Stormy Owen, and as constituency MLAs at that time, we were obviously dealing with a lot of people who were in very desperate situations without power for days, and in some instances weeks at a time. And the public's perception very much is that NIE are a private company who are operating with massive profits, and that basis should then be compensating. And I know there was talk around, you know, the potential of a goodwill. I wonder if you could clarify. I know you've sort of set that out in terms of the RP7 and how the system actually works, but if you could clarify the situation with NIE and profits and how that actually works.
So I'll let John explain the details of that. But in terms of what we could do in Storm Éowyn or any other future storm, it's governed by a legislative mandate, and we don't. Where in Great Britain, they have an ability through legislation that was brought through in 2005 to pay for storm compensation. Now that's paid by the rest of the consumer base. It's a pass-through. It's not paid by the company, but. So that's why there was no regulatory means, because there was no statute, there was no legislative remit. But John, do you want to explain how NIE as a regulated company makes its profits?
Yes, the fundamental basis for NIE's profits is that it has currently invested about £2 billion on our behalf, which we haven't paid for yet, and it has to finance that investment. By the time we get to RP7, that figure will be in excess of £3 billion because, again, of the accelerated investment we're putting in now. When we're looking at how NIE can be financed, we first look at what a reasonable cost of capital, a reasonable return for that is. We look at the balance of a reasonable balance of debt and equity. And essentially what NIE makes profit on is on the equity investment, which is about, in RP6, was about over half that £2 billion. And it makes that profit at a rate of return that we determine by looking at what markets will bear in terms of raising capital and looking at what future interest rates will be. So the kind of return on capital we're dealing with in RP7 is about 4.5% per annum. Now, bear in mind that's a real rate of return, so you have to add inflation to that in the way that the company's rewarded. But is that roughly 4.5% of a bit over £1 billion that is the company's profit? And I think it's important to sort of emphasise that this company, as the other companies we regulate, are competing with others for capital in a very active investment market as we move to net zero. And the levels of return that we have are competitive with what we see in GB and the rest of the world, because this is a stable industry. It should be essentially a low-risk industry to invest in at a very low rate of return. And then that probably leads me on to another important point in this, I think, is that low rate of return is a consequence of a predictable and stable regulatory environment. And it's important, one of the messages I'd want to leave with you, it's very important that we maintain that predictable, stable environment for these companies to invest, so they do get that low return on capital. I think I would probably emphasise, and just the importance of that, is that return on capital and that investment is about a third of the revenue that we pay for a network. It's not an insignificant part of it. So if I can summarise quickly then, the large part of the profit flows from the fact that we're investing significant sums of money which we haven't paid for yet. And that profit is necessary to allow that investment to be raised. If it can't be raised, it becomes a barrier to achieving the things we want to achieve around net zero. And it is a very important, significant part. It's about 30% of the revenue.
Thanks. Just one more question, Chair, if that's okay. So you referred there to Storm EO and the I suppose fallout from that and the lack of legislation to ensure that the customers were compensated or were paid in that at that time period. We had previously heard in another presentation around the consultation that yourselves were carrying out. I think there was a previous iteration of it, and then there's a current one in 2023 around removing that exemption for extreme weather in terms of the need to compensate. I wondered what the feedback of that consultation is, or where that's at.
Yeah, so we have it's called Guaranteed Standards of Service, and they are in place. The legislative regime is in place to compensate consumers in normal circumstances if they are off supply, and it compensates them for the period of time it takes NIE to restore supply. So it is essentially, it's supposed to be punitive in nature in terms of if NIE have not done all they can within their power and reasonable endeavours to put supply back on. That's the current framework. We as a regulator went out in 2023 to consult and concluded that consultation in November 2023. What actually happened when we got the responses back in, it flagged up a few legal issues that we had to work through with NIE and suppliers in terms of where responsibilities for different aspects lay. We've taken sort of 2024 to work through that with that stakeholder group, not a public consultation, and we are now working on a revised consultation which we hope to issue in advance of the summer, which will now, as a result of Storm Eowyn, include the question again as what should we do as Northern Ireland PLC in relation to compensation for storm payments. Once we get the result, we're going to go out for a 3-month consultation so that it is a hot topic of conversation. We all know that, so everybody has a fair opportunity to respond. Once we get the responses back to that, what we'll do is look at the responses, analyse, and we'll cost them out, because it's difficult to say, if everybody says yes, we should have compensation, then as John has rightly said, that is paid for in GB by the wider consumer base. So we will need to cost out the implications of that consultation response and decisions. Once we've done that, we will present it to the department to make the regulations. We will be working with, and has as closely as yesterday been in liaison with DFE about moving this consultation process forward collectively, and we've been speaking to NIE as well, so it was supposed to happen this year in any event. Storm Owen has presented us with an opportunity to learn the lessons of this and see how that consultation can be better informed so that we get a more fulsome response. So that is all in train, in action, and the consultation should issue this side of the summer.
Thank you. Thanks a million. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, very useful. And the department have been, I suppose, warmed to the idea of working in partnership in that respect and consultation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Good. Okay, Diana.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Welcome to the committee this morning. I wanted to ask you, we had a presentation recently on smart metering and just your views on it. I understand it would be going into 920,000 consumers, so it's a massive project there that if it were to be rolled out, and how does that fit within RP7? Would you have to revise those costs there, and how to socialise those costs across the consumers?
So RP7 purposely hasn't looked at smart meters until we understand the scale of the project, so that would have to be reopened to take account of that. But I don't know if Peter or John, you want to add?
Yes, we've made provision in RP7 for the company to seek additional funding to develop smart metering as a concept and a process. We haven't yet made provision for the investment that would flow from that. But once that investment comes in, again, as you referenced, sort of 920,000 consumers, there's a significant period of work, so it will take a period of time. I don't think that's quite been set out yet as to what that period will be. And it will also be, again, a cost. Every time we implement something like this, these costs are socialised in some way across consumers' bills. The second part and challenge will be actually raising the finance again, because that investment in metering will be done through borrowing and equity injection. And that places another challenge on us, and it elevates the amount of borrowing than equity that the company needs. And that always puts an upward pressure potentially on the cost of equity. So again, within this, yes, if we proceed with this, it will be put through the price control. There are mechanisms which allow us to do that. It will be at an additional cost, and that cost will be reflected back onto consumers' bills. And we just need to be cautious all the time about the pace at which something like that can be delivered. It is a large enterprise.
If you have that in tandem, ultimately when if smart metering is introduced, the costs will be passed on to the consumer, but there will be savings for the consumer in other ways. But you've also looking at costs of Storm Owen having to be borne by the consumers as well. So how do you measure what's tolerable for the consumer in a reasonable way as a utility regulator?
Yeah, it's a really important point. So all the decisions that we take, we have the consumer at the heart of all those decisions, and you've rightly said all the decisions have an impact on the consumer, adding or taking away cost. So we're working really closely with the department on smart metering, and off the back of their consultation, we're working to establish an oversight group between ourselves and the department on that. But the cost of the energy transition is really important to consider. So DAERA are looking at this from the Climate Change Act in terms of a just transition and setting up those bodies there. We're working with the department and with the system operator, SUNY, on modelling the energy transition so that all of these costs are taken into consideration and mapped out, so towards 2030, 40, 50, to understand the impact on consumers, because fuel poverty in Northern Ireland is incredibly high compared to other jurisdictions. So you're right, it has to be tolerable, it has to be a just transition. So we are working with the department and with other stakeholders on that modelling to make sure it's evidence-based. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Diana. Sinead.
Okay, thank you very much for all your answers so far. I suppose there's two things I want to ask you about. The first one is the interconnector and your vagaries around that and around the issue of licences. and we've had Lear and other interconnector investors saying that they're really concerned that the legislation is not forthcoming and the policy is not forthcoming regarding the cabin floor. Can you talk your way through that, just as a utility regulator, how important that is, that there's a framework to work through?
You'll have probably seen we've provided Lyric with a license. Under our legislation, Ofgem, the regulator in Great Britain, has the ability to provide an interconnector license. We don't have the ability to provide an interconnector license, so we've had to look at adapting a transmission license. So it works, but it's not perfect. So and there's other issues around batteries and other newer technologies that weren't foreseen back in 2003 when the legislation was brought forward of the type of technologies that would be available today. So it's very, as John and Peter have been saying, it's very important that a regulator does everything on firm foundations. It's important that the legislation is there in place. So it would be really good if our legislative mandate enabled us in the future to provide transmission licenses, provide battery storage licenses and things like that. So the technology fits the license that's been issued. The government the department at the moment is looking at interconnection policy, and we look forward to seeing how that develops. But I don't know, Colin, if you want to say anything from a wholesale market side.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered most of it. As John mentioned there, we issued the license to the Lyra interconnector in December last year. And part of the lead up to issuing that license, we set out a two-step process. We're trying to be pragmatic, operating within the existing structures. And the first step was to issue the license. The other piece of that is whether there's an operating revenue regime. I think Lyric would have talked about like a cap and floor regime to support that investment. And that's the step two. And we're working with ourselves, just looking through in terms of what the next steps are in that process that involve detailed analysis in terms of the benefits and costs of the Lyric interconnector. But two, we're working very closely with the DFE in relation to making sure that there's alignment in terms of policy before we introduce such a mechanism. And there's been a lot of engagement over the last few weeks around that process. But that is a complicated process and will take several months to work through.
Yeah, it's just our understanding from the investor's perspective that, that they're about to invest a significant amount of money, have already invested a significant amount of money, and just that sense of urgency isn't there within the department in order to give them further clarity of where the framework or the mechanism is going to, finish off or complete. So there's a real problem there, and it's back probably, John, to what you started off with in terms of the vagaries of the utility regulator here and then Ofgem. There's just such a difference, and when we were briefed by the department back in November, was it around then sometime, they indicated that they were going to bring forward a short bill in order to close some of these gaps. But just in your paper, you have outlined all of the various legislative acts. There's 12 primary acts that are not going to be included in the short bill, and that, even when the short bill goes through, you're still not on solid ground in terms of the legislative framework. How impactful is that on your ability to do your job as a regulator and to protect the consumers?
Is going back to John's point about the regulation's meant to be really boring. It's meant to be a Ronseal type product. It's meant to be very predictable. The companies can invest on that basis. They can invest on a long-term basis, and that brings the cost of borrowing down, and that's kind of the process. So the greater the legislative mandate for what the regulator's trying to do, just increases that certainty. Essentially, we're making legislation that's 20, 30 years old applicable for today. Ofgem have had that increase in legislation that allows it to look at issues like decarbonisation and one thing and another, and we just hope eventually that we're there to support consumers in Northern Ireland. I think it's just with one thing and another that it's getting our legislation back up to where equivalent regulatory bodies have it.
Just as my concern is so the rest of this mandate, we're not going to meet the needs of the utility regulator in terms of legislation. So we will be looking, we'll be pushing that into the next mandate in the next 5 years in order to bring that legislation through. And we're only catching up on where others are already at in the rest of the UK. And it's just concerning to us because investors get very, very scared when they're coming into a place to invest when the legislation is not there to protect them as well as our consumers. So it's something that we have raised as a committee to the department and we'll continue to do so. Thanks.
Okay. David?
Okay, I just... You've covered a lot, and thank you for coming in, John. It's always great to have you, and always full answers to us, the committee, which is really appreciated. A couple of weeks ago, the department sat in front of us after we were talking about compensation and the storm damage and that, and they indicated to us, and I'm going from memory, but it was 13 million roughly around that, 6.5 million of which would be borne by the public. So, that kind of shocked us at that time, that not only were we not talking about compensation to customers, we're actually talking about additional cost to customers. Is that cost included in the RP7? Or it's in the last? So is there an additional cost to consumers?
Yeah, John, do you want to explain the RP6 mechanisms? It's still to be finalised.
Yes, I'll work through this one. We, in our price controls for NIE, we set a series of allowances. So we set a target cost in advance, in effect. And that can come in a number of ways. It can come as a sum of money or a unit rate for completing a piece of work, which gives an allowance. NIE will spend what it needs to spend to deliver that work. It will either be higher or lower than the amount we have determined. In those circumstances, there's a cost-sharing mechanism where NIE carry 50% of either the underspend, so they retain 50% of it, or they pay 50% of the overspend, and consumers cover the rest. So what you've heard about Storm Éowyn is that is the mechanism in RP6. It is also the mechanism in RP7. When something goes wrong, NIE can't come back to us and essentially recover all of their costs. They recover half of them as part of the global costs, and consumers pick up the other half. That is there. It's not unusual to us. It's not unusual indeed to NIE within Northern Ireland, but it's not unusual to us in Northern Ireland. It's the same kind of process you'll see existing in other regulated businesses, certainly across the UK and in the Republic of Ireland. And that is there really to, again, bring down the risks of this company. That if it was subject to some huge overspend that would impact on its financing, that would be sort of muted and mitigated by this mechanism where consumers will always pick up half of the bill. And indeed, where the company outperforms, they don't just walk away with all of that money, they only retain half of it. So what you're seeing with Storm Éowyn, we're looking at that particular, is something which exists within the wider package of overall underspend and overspend. It doesn't exist in isolation. But it is right that as a result of that mechanism, because of the 50-50, consumers will be picking up half of that cost.
So we've gone from a place where consumers were being told that we're going to be compensated for the loss of electricity for 6, 7, 8, 9 days, whatever the timeline was in their own areas, to a place where they're going to actually pay for this. That you're actually going to add to the cost of consumers. Now, I understand how that, for NIE and how that looks there, but to the consumer who have lost their fridges of food, of freezers of food, and been left with no electricity, to then be told that you're going to pay the cost or 50% of the cost, isn't acceptable.
I think, and I don't want to sort of try to debate the impact it has on consumers, because we're all aware, we are all consumers, and we're all impacted by these events. But this has to be reviewed within that wider context of other risks that exist to the company. NIE themselves, in terms of this event, which for all of us I think was unprecedented.
Yeah, absolutely,
the impact was unprecedented. Is not at that sense, I suppose, that fault that that things.
Do you have a company that have made pre-tax profits of 90+ million? We're not talking about a company that isn't making massive profits.
Yes.
So the context is you have a company that is making pre-tax profits close to 3 figures in millions, and then the consumers have been told they're going to pay 50% of the cost. That's the bit that is the context.
Yes, but the context, as I go back to the point, regulation is meant to be boring. It's meant to be predictable. So they're when the rules, they're the rules of the game in terms of. So there is these mechanisms. It's all about regulation's all about reducing the risk to consumers, and it's fairly balancing the risk between consumers and the regulated entity. It's about reducing the risk to the regulated entity by making the investment environment as predictable as possible. So then when they come to borrow money for the £2.2 billion worth of investment, that they can borrow it at the lowest rate, because it's seen as a guarantee. You both know the rules of the game, and the rules of the game are stable. The level of profit also then equates to the size of the investment that's been going on. So, and as John says, a lot of the majority of the funding, the profit, goes back into the system as it's financing the debt that they've. So it's just like a mortgage. You some of the money you're giving NIE in terms of profit is enabling them to pay their mortgage payments. So it's that cycle that you're allowing them to invest you're allowing them to invest, but they physically don't have the money themselves at this moment, so they have to go and borrow it. And then what you're allowing them in their profit is an amount that can then pay for their mortgage payments, essentially.
Okay, just if we move on then to RP 7, our net zero targets, our 80 by 30 targets, have always been constrained by lack of connections. Will RP 7 deliver all of or enable NIE to have all the connections that will meet that 80 by 30 target?
I'm always very nervous of the word "all" at any point in the conversation.
Well, it's a target. Are we going to hit the target?
Yes.
Are we not going to?
Essentially, what we do is that we make the provision for NIE to meet that target. So they have sufficient funding to meet the level of connections that we have. The other thing that we've done in the price control is to build flexibility into it. So where we're looking particularly at the 11 kV and the low voltage networks, which are the ones closest to us, where most of us will connect our electric vehicles, etc. If NIE have to carry out further work to meet those targets, they are able to flex the price control because essentially they have a unit rate for carrying out that work. So the barriers to meeting net zero will essentially not be the funding model. The barriers, I think, will be the challenge of resources. There's a huge escalation of work being carried out here, and in some respects, the limit is the number of skilled people to carry out that work. And the other part of the process will be a challenge, will be delivering on the larger scale network, some of the transmission lines that we have to build, which are of themselves quite significant engineering projects. They're high value projects, they take time to develop, but they're also subject to the challenges of finding the right route through with landowners and finding the right route through things like planning. Mm-hmm. And it's that issue of planning, procurement, getting the right access, and being able to get the skilled people to carry out the work that will be the challenge, not the funding model itself. Now, we have made the provision for the funding to allow those things to be developed, but those things that I've alluded to are potentially barriers. you want to touch on that, John, anymore? No, we're fine.
Oh, that's great. You clarified that's perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, that was useful, David. And just on that point, I suppose, of renewables, and there's a focus on that, and understandably within society and within this assembly. But in terms of your view, in terms of renewables, to what extent will that protect us in the future from global variations, from some of the shocks that we've seen? What will be the benefits there for Northern Ireland and for its consumers going forward?
So there's really, and we'll send the committee a copy of it. The Economist did a piece on this for Great Britain a fortnight ago, explaining how the pricing model occurs in Great Britain. Yep. We're even more accentuated than that, because where the island of Ireland struggles in terms, and Colin might want, struggles in terms of wholesale prices, it's what is the last generator on? What is the base load generation? So the island of Ireland, unless we decide to go down nuclear routes or we decide to go down different, we'll always use gas as its base load generation. So gas will set the price of the cost of electricity on the island of Ireland. Now, renewables will dilute that, but it won't get rid of it 100% with current technology. Now, future technology, you might bring batteries in, and you might have more reliable forms of renewables. But in terms of pricing, it's that last bit of energy, the last bit of electricity that sets the price under the European target model. And unfortunately for the island of Ireland and for Great Britain, the price is set by gas, and that is fluctuating, as you've seen on wholesale prices. Colin, I don't know if you want to...
I think you've covered it there. I suppose the only thing, just in terms of generally reducing the amount of gas on our system, will help in terms of that pricing piece. So increasing renewables, making use of the renewables we have, using things like interconnection, demand response, storage, those types of technologies can help in terms of the overall mix of generation and reduce dependency on gas. So that will potentially help. The other aspect that may be worth mentioning as well, that if renewables are brought on and DFE are proposing to any new support scheme, will be a contract for difference scheme. So that will create a price stability as well, because if wholesale prices are high, then those renewables would pay back through that contract for difference scheme, and vice versa. So that will just another aspect in terms of bringing stability to the overall end consumer price.
Thank you for that. Sinead, did you want to come in?
Just a wee quick question. Not a very hard question at all. Just about, it is very difficult, but in the global context and the war in Ukraine and the impact it's having on the stability of prices, is there anything coming out there now that when you're looking forward for purchase prices?
So I think, as I said before, so gas was always roughly 50 pence a therm. Before the Ukraine war, 20 years, it was 50 pence per therm. It went up to £9 a therm when Russia invaded the Ukraine. It's now dropped back to about £1.06. Now it fluctuates. So when President Trump, mentioned a peace treaty in January with Ukraine and Russia, you saw prices fall by roughly about 40 pence. It was about £1.40, and it came down to £1.06. So it's roughly at that level, but so it's still double what it was prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Just a final question from me, and it was just in relation to, and I'm aware obviously the difference in terms of the energy market here and in GB, but in terms of the price, the cap that applies in GB, and that's due to increase now in April, isn't that right? Will there be a similar increase here in Northern Ireland?
It's a slightly different type of regulation. So Europe decided that there shouldn't be any regulation of retail prices, essentially. Northern Ireland, because of its size of its market, never went down that route. GB did, and then you probably remember last part of the last decade, there was a lot of calls on Ofgem to bring in some type of regulation. So there is no regulation in the Republic of Ireland, still keeping with the European model. What Ofgem did was they decided to kind of do a price bubble that all the supply companies in GB could operate, and that's kind of what the price cap is. So it sets a bubble for all companies to operate. What we do is we regulate the largest suppliers, so Power NI in electricity, who's got about 60% market share, and then SSE Electricity for gas in Belfast and Firmus outside of Belfast. And so we look at that on a 3-month, 6-month basis. So sometimes our prices, at the moment, our prices are cheaper than GB and significantly cheaper than the Republic of Ireland. But that can just swing. It's kind of when the regulation puts its foot on the ball, so it could be that Ofgem made a decision in their mechanism and it's caused higher prices in Northern Ireland. But if you look at the long-term graph, they're virtually there or thereabouts. It's just when the various regulator puts the foot on the ball in terms of when they do the calculation of the sums. But at this point in time, we're slightly cheaper. Yeah.
Okay, members, I think that's, I don't know, other indications for questions. So look, I want to thank you very much for taking the time and again for hanging around for that delay that we had. But it was a very useful session. And look, we will be keeping in touch with yourselves, obviously, and we appreciate and value the relationship that we have with yourselves. And we look forward to hearing from you, no doubt, in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay.
Decision-making quorums.
Yes.
The attendant, please.
Okay, members, that is us in terms of, obviously we've really dealt with the correspondence. So we are going to move now just briefly to the forward work programme and just summarise as to where we're going next week.
Okay, members, just to remind you that next week it's Game of Thrones, followed by the Deluxe Group. That's quite a full day, quite a full programme, so it is. And then the week after that, it's the Minister, who will be coming to us to also talk about student loans. And hopefully we can agree this next week, a quick chat with Claire from Engagement about the Balmoral show. And then after Easter recess, our first meeting after Easter recess is in Coleraine at the Further Education College there. So since you don't have decision-making quorum, you can't agree to anything. So
and in terms of the Minister's engagement with us, time-wise, what do we have?
Well, it's usually an hour and a half, so she will come along at 10, and I hope she'll do an hour and a half with her senior officials. It would be usually these things are quite. I've told the Dallo I expect to be quite wide-ranging. You can ask her about her legislation. You're going to ask her about the budget because we should have clarity by then. Legally, we will have to have clarity by then on what the budget will be 25-26. So what the implications may be. So all that good stuff can be talked about then, Chairperson.
Well, thank you very much, Clerk, and to your team as usual for what you've done. Members, any other business? No. Oh, sorry, apologies. Any other business? And the date and time of next meeting. Obviously, we're meeting at 10:30 over at the Game of Thrones.
You send us all the.
We'll send you the details.
Send you a nice map, etc. And we'll. And if we can go down.
Okay, members. Committee content to adjourn. Adjourn.
Okay. Committee Room 30. Sound. Committee Room 30. Sound.